Tom, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Osnor, thank you very much for inviting me.
It's very hard to introduce you because when you go to your Wikipedia page, there are so many different things, the titles and all these things you're involved in. So when people ask you what you do, how do you answer?
I say that I'm a political activist.
I've seen the pictures of you on your Instagram, how you are protesting alongside of the citizens of the United States for the civil rights of minorities in the country. One question I have for you. So I'm assuming you saw the video of George Floyd circulating online. What went through your mind when you saw it?
Was terribly, terribly sad to see someone get killed. Everybody's seen, or let me say, I've seen lots of movies where someone gets killed, but actually seeing footage of someone being killed sticks in your mind forever. And so, that is a level of transparency that is really disturbing.
I
and
agree.
Setting. And it was something where you felt like, oh my, that gets you in your core of this is terribly, terribly wrong. What's going on? I'm watching something wrong here that is unsettling, absolutely unacceptable, and that you're looking at something bad in real life, not Hollywood.
Did you anticipate such a widespread protests that actually went over the borders too?
There's an old Hemingway quote from The Sun Also Rises. How did you go bankrupt? 2 ways, slowly and then all at once. And so if you think about the George Floyd video in that context, there are centuries of structural racism in the United States of America. I talked about structural racism every single day when I was running for president. I talked about reparations for Black people every single day, including to all white audiences. So from my point of view, the George Floyd video was and then all at once. How did you go bankrupt? Slowly and then all at once. Was the all at once. It's like that video validated and symbolized something that in society that people have been protesting for as long as I've been alive and a lot longer than that. And it was just saying, okay, here is something visceral, upsetting, emotional, that brings to a head feelings that people have had literally for hundreds of years.
How do you think the system are gonna change after this protests, like in the immediate term and the long term? What changes you anticipate?
It'll be interesting to see, because I think when you think about systemic change, and I really only understand it in the context of the United States, it happens a couple different ways. One is by a reordering of the way that we understand the world together. And I think that on a fundamental level, this video, this series of protests, I hope, is sort of rearranging Americans' understanding that, yeah, there really is, you can't hide your eyes from the fact there's structural racism that is going on a daily basis and really unfairly impacting people's lives at the most basic level. So the way that change happens here really is by reframing our understanding around the world. That's what the New Deal was. That's what the Civil War was. That's what World War II was, the big changes in how we think. And so from that reordering and that reframing come a series of specific political decisions about how we police and how we educate and how we house and, a whole bunch of things, but with the context of a different understanding of structural racism. And so, if the first has happened, we will continue to be seeing its effects 40 years from now in terms of the way decisions are made in local government, in state government, and in national government.
And one thing that actually shows how big of issue it was, as we are in the middle of this pandemic where people try to stay separate, stay at home, and suddenly you see all these big rallies around the world, and in United States in particular. And I think it's also like big indication of that's something very, very, very serious.
Well, the idea of having a gathering, just getting to the idea of having a gathering was a really high hurdle.
Yeah.
Because the whole point about the pandemic is we need to be careful about social distancing. We need to be careful about masks. We need to be careful about not passing the virus back and forth. So in order to reach the hurdle of it's important enough to get to have large gatherings meant that it had to reach a level of emotionality and significance and impact to pass that test.
Yeah, and speaking of COVID, which is unprecedented on itself, you're on a task force on business and job recovery, and you're co-chairing that task force. And I looked through the list of people who are involved, and I was amazed. You have 4 former governors, you have 80 business leaders. What's the role of this committee? What do you guys do? And with I think phase 3 just started last Friday. What do you expect from it?
Well, the job of the task force really is to give advice to Governor Gavin Newsom to try and make sure that we open as fast and successfully as possible, consistent with the idea that the health and lives of Californians come first. And the idea is that we've seen a huge, drop in economic activity across the United States, including in California. And that we need to be smart in how the state supports Californians in rebuilding that employment and rebuilding those jobs and that business. And that we do it not to try to get back to January of 2020, but to do it with the idea of equity and justice in the front of our minds, with the idea of sustainability and resilience. We had principles of equity, including the idea specifically about redressing structural racism before the murder of George Floyd. We had those principles and our mission statement in 3 sentences talked about equity and justice in 2 of the 3 sentences. So the point of the task force is to bring the experience and knowledge of people from across the states, business leaders, union leaders, community leaders, and as you said, political leaders, including 4 former governors, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, bring that wealth of experience and knowledge to help Gavin as he, comes up with the phases and the protocols to reopen California and then to rebuild California.
Do you think the country is going back to January 2020 anytime soon, if at all?
We're never going back to January 2020.
Really?
Hopefully we're going to go to a better place.
Okay.
I don't think we should, we started by talking about structural racism, George Floyd, and justice and equity. I think that as we rebuild, we should have that in our mind. One of the things we're trying to do, Osnor, is we are trying to, quote unquote, bridge the digital divide, make sure that everybody is connected to high-speed internet. That's really necessary from an equity standpoint. How are kids going to go to school if school includes a significant online portion unless they're connected to high-speed internet? 80%, I talked to one of the people who runs one of the big health organizations in California. 80% of their doctor's visits are now virtual visits. It's gone up by, I think, 100 times.
Interesting. Yeah.
So, are we ever going back to January of 2020? I was talking to somebody today about what's happened to some of the online shopping services. Up 500% since March. Are we ever going back to January of 2020? 40% of the jobs can be done from home. Things, those are accelerations of trends, but you said, are we going back? We're going to a different place, and we need to make sure it's a place that respects and redresses racial injustice, particularly because Black and brown communities are bearing the brunt of the health impacts of this coronavirus and the economic impacts, the job impacts, the employment impacts of this slowdown. So no, we're not going back in that sense. The virtual world, the online world's significance was growing anyway, but the rate of that growth has accelerated. And I think there's no way to think about the world on June 15th of 2020 without being aware that unless we move to a sustainable world, we're going to be an unsustainable world. And that we're going to be dealing with the implications of that, just as we're dealing with the implications of this viral pandemic. And so if you're not thinking about creating, moving to a more sustainable path, a different trajectory, that is going to be, in my mind, a tragic mistake.
One thing I wanted to touch base with you, given your background, you're one of few people qualified to talk about economics and politics combined. You mentioned the economic impact on the country. How can you reconcile what's been happening on the economy with the markets? What's happening with markets? Because it seems like markets just didn't even notice that something is wrong with the country.
Well, Osnor, Warren Buffett said something about markets a long time ago that I believe. In the short run, they're a popularity contest. In the long run, they're an adding machine. Markets move around. And so they are the compendium of people's opinions right now. Doesn't mean those opinions are right. If the opinions were right, a market would go like that, as opposed to like this. There's a lot of unknowns right now for this country. We don't know when there will be cheap, ubiquitous testing. We don't know. We don't know when there will be a therapeutic solution to COVID-19. We don't know when there will be a vaccine. So that we're going to be operating in a sense, in a state of uncertainty, but with a viral pandemic for an indeterminate amount of time. So markets are making guesses about how that's going to turn out. They're making guesses about the level of economic activity, and they're making guesses about what happens on November 3rd, 2020. And I can tell you, having been a market participant for a long time, markets can be dramatically wrong and they can move in dramatic fashion. I was around in 87 when it went down over 20% in a day. Did the world change 20% that day between Friday night and Monday morning? Absolutely not. Didn't move 1%. People changed their minds. So I don't take the short run fluctuations of markets as the determinations of wisdom.
With that said, how would you grade the work that Fed has done with and separately, how would you grade this CARE Act that government came up with?
Well, I want to say I think the Fed's done a very good job.
Mm-hmm.
We are in an unprecedented situation. A lot of times when you look at economic and political events, there are comparables. You go back and say, well, this reminds me of 1954. This reminds me of 1932. This reminds me of what happened in the 70s, yada, yada. And you say, here's what worked. There's evidence, you in effect have a laboratory where people have reacted and you can see what worked and what didn't. So you try and go to the stuff that worked. This is unprecedented. We don't know. But the Fed acted in a way that I think we don't know all of the unintended consequences, which I'm sure there will be many of what they did, but they acted forcefully and in my mind, effectively to prevent the worst from happening in the short run. So I give them a lot of credit about that. I really do. I think the Congress has also acted as fast as they could to try to, bring legislation to support working people, to support businesses, to try and ease the problems of the near term. And where there, legislation is more complicated than money. And so were there plenty of issues about it? Yes. And does the federal government need to support state and local governments going forward, something they haven't done yet? It is absolutely critical for them to do. Yes. So the job is incomplete. But by and large, the Congress stepped up to try and do what they could to take away the short-term worst impacts of the, really severe slowdown, economic slowdown that comes with closing big parts of the economy to prevent this pandemic from spiraling out of control.
I'm gonna get a little political here. I just want to get your opinion. So country was a little slow in the response, and it is my theory that the president and administration probably realized that if they ring the alarm too early, the effect on the market is going to be very dramatic, and it might have caused their election. Do you think that has a merit, or I'm missing something?
I try not to impute motives to other people when I really don't know what they are. I think there's no question that the federal government has delegated to the states the overwhelmingly bulk of the responsibility for responding to this pandemic, in terms of closing down state by state, personal protective equipment, state by state, opening up, and the protocols for opening up, meaning that whether you have to mask, whether you have to social distance, whether the protocols about cleaning and hand washing, state by state, phasing the timing of opening up the different parts of society, state by state. So to a very large extent, the federal government has delegated all of these issues to the governors, to the counties, to the mayors. And so it's been, very, very disparate across America how governors have chosen to respond.
Do you think it was the right approach, or it should have been centralized?
Look, on some of this stuff, I believe when you have a national crisis, you need national leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't think there's any question but that it's important for us to get back to the idea that we're one country, that we are together in a crisis. And let me say this, Osnoor, in California, what I've seen on this task force is people putting aside partisanship. Democrats and Republicans worried about lives and livelihoods of Californians, not worried about their agendas. The head of the California Chamber of Commerce putting aside his traditional, agenda just to try and make sure that the best happens for California. And, across and both sides of the aisle. I hope it can, I can't tell you what will happen going forward, but so far I can tell you what's supposed to happen in a crisis is what I just said. You put aside your personal agenda to do what's right and deal with the other stuff later. And that has happened here. And I think that, that is the spirit that wins, you can't have people acting on their own, for their own agenda in the context of a crisis where people are, hundreds of thousands of people, over 100,000 people have died, hundreds of thousands of people potentially can die, and where you have, tens of millions of Americans lose their job. That is something where you feel as if, gosh, let me, and which is I think the attitude of the people on the task force is, let me do what I can to contribute in a genuine way. And that's what is going to be meaningful to me. And that's, hopefully that will work out for me in the long run. Hopefully it'll work out for my agenda, but that's what has to happen now.
Well, it's great to hear that all these differences were put aside. You recently were running you had a campaign for Democratic presidential nomination. And tell me a little bit about that campaign, and what do you think you should have done differently, and what was the most surprising thing for you? What do you enjoy, what you didn't?
Well, Osnoor, first of all, you should know I absolutely loved it. Honestly, I basically got a chance 7 days a week for the entire campaign to meet people across the United States, learn more about their lives, understand what was motivating them, understand what was affecting them, but also, and in a very real way, seeing how great they were. Seeing how nice people are, how hardworking people are, how decent people are, really how sweet they are and impressive. So from my standpoint, God, I hugged tens of thousands of people. And it wasn't a fake. I mean, I really felt as if, my gosh, these people deserve fantastic leadership because they're fantastic. So that was and I've done that as a political activist for a decade. So it wasn't a surprise, but it was more intense, more frequent than ever before in my life. And maybe that's the most intense I'll ever be in terms of that function. But it really was truly a gift to me, and I believe made me, a better person. My daughter was on the campaign. I have one daughter who's 28 years old. She was on the campaign, I think, for 3 months. And I said, Ev, what do you think? And she said, I feel like I'm a much better person. It's such an immense privilege to meet this many people and have an honest conversation with them, and a personal conversation. I'm a better person, and I'm more religious. And I said, Ev, how can you be more religious? You don't even believe in God. And she goes, I do now.
That's interesting. And why did you decide to run this year?
I thought I had something to say. And if you go back and look, I was in the middle of I'd just come off the impeachment fight, which wasn't over by the time I started running, but where I felt as if what I could do was mostly over or overwhelmingly over, which I think was true. But, as I said, I talked about racial justice every single day on the campaign and tried to make it something that people had to confront, and reparations. I talked about climate every single day on the campaign and tried to make it something that people couldn't get away from. I tried to talk about economic justice, as you said. Look, I have a decades-long experience in thinking about the intersection between economics and policy and politics. I was, believe it or not, in college, I was an economics and political science major, thinking about how these economic political systems work, what makes them work effectively, what brings equality and justice to them, what fails. So I felt like that's something that I have, and I'd worked in the private sector for decades. I felt like there's something here that I'm different, that I think needs to be said, and I don't think people are making those points or I don't think they're making them effectively enough. That's why I wanted to run, because I thought there were things that need to be said and done. And, that's why when people said, is this hard? Is this painful? You must be really tired. I would say, no, it's not hard. It's not painful. And I'm not tired, because I'm doing exactly what I think needs to be done. And I get to meet all these fantastic people along the way.
And one thing I was curious about, you have the certain dynamics on the stage during debates. How is it behind the stage? Are you guys friends? Just like, hey, let's just go there and have fun? Or you sincerely attacking each other? I'm just curious.
It's funny. It reminded me at the time, I played sports since I was a little boy right through the end of college. For me, seriously, given my capabilities. And it was a lot like sports in the sense that it's competitive, and that you're going up against each other. At the same time, there's a level of respect for each other, and afterwards there's a level of respect, and I think in many cases warmth, that you think back and think, oh, that's a pretty nice woman, or that's a pretty nice man, and they were doing something that they thought was important, and I respect them for that. So but there's a level of competition in it. I mean, you can't get away from that. So it's kind of a dual emotional thing.
Tom, I would like to learn a little bit more about you, not as an activist, political figure, but as a person. And I think the best way of doing it is kind of go chronologically. So let's go back all the way to your childhood. Just tell me where you grew up and where you were born and grew up.
So I'm from New York, and I'm really from New York. I'm from right in the middle of Manhattan. My dad was from Brooklyn. He was a lawyer. He went to law school, got out, worked in a law firm, quit to go be a naval officer. In World War II, because he was a lawyer, they made him the assistant to the chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, prosecuted Nazis, came back and was a lawyer for the rest of his life. My mom was from Minneapolis. She came to New York the day she graduated from college. She wrote for Newsweek. That was her first job out of college. Then she wrote the NBC Evening News. Then she was one of the producers at NBC. And then she quit to be a mom. And when I went to kindergarten, I'm the youngest of three boys. She got her master's in education in New York and ran school volunteer programs in some of the lowest performing schools around the city and taught remedial reading in the Brooklyn House of Detention. So she was someone who was very much of a political activist. You know, she saw her work in education as being a part of the civil rights movement to try and give young people a chance to, in life, to get an education and to get a decent opportunity. She felt exactly the same way about teaching in the Brooklyn House of Detention. Both of those schools and that jail were overwhelmingly populated by overwhelmingly Black and brown people, which was the reason she was doing it. Mm-hmm. And she was, you know, a very fiery political person. As I like to say, in 1972, I don't know who my dad voted for, but I know my mom voted for Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman to ever run for president, and who was like people, and everyone's like, isn't that cute? My mother's like, no, it's not cute. She's the best person in the race by a million miles. And everyone's like, oh, isn't that cute? She said, no, really, take a look. And if you look back to 1972, Richard Nixon, George McGovern, Shirley Chisholm, let me just say, my mom wasn't kidding. She voted for by far the best person in that race.
What did you learn from your mom? I'm assuming that she's the one who influenced your political views.
Well, you know, it's sort of funny because when I think about my mom, she's the opposite of a limousine liberal. You know, my mom got around New York City on a bicycle. If she rode up to Harlem to teach or to shop, both of which she did, she rode her bicycle. And she was a tough guy. You know, she had a temper. She didn't like injustice. And when she found it, she got mad. And she was a fighter. And that's what I saw. It wasn't a theory for her. You know, when I asked her about an issue, she was relating it to human beings who she knew and cared about. And so when you talk to, you know, if you talk to my mom about racial justice, she would get mad. If you talk to her about the Vietnam War, she would get mad. There was very much a sense of justice pushing her, and she was really religious. Mm-hmm. So a big part of it was a feeling about, you know, doing the right thing, morality, being that kind of person, which could be a big pain in the neck, trust me. But.
And speaking of morality you known for your you and your wife are known for your philanthropic activities. What do you think is the most what's the most thing you're proud of in that area of your life?
Well, let me say this, Osnor. You know, I don't really like the word philanthropy because to me, what that kind of connotes and implies is a rich person writing a check and sort of giving some largesse. And I don't really believe in that model. And I try to do the opposite of that, to be honest. So Kat and I started a community bank, 15 years ago, which is basically a nonprofit bank that we've funded on the basis of the mission statement of economic justice, environmental sustainability, and supporting businesses owned by women and people of color. And so when you know, it's now over $1 billion. We did I'm going to get the number wrong, an enormous amount of PPP this year. We think we saved tens of thousands of jobs to the businesses that got that. We measure, we had to develop the measures to do it, but we think of it as a triple bottom line, which is we have to be sustainable economically, but we also measure sustainability and economic and racial justice in every single loan. And, you know, we have to, 75% of the loans have to be positive impact on the community that is measurable, and all of them can't be, none of them can be negative. So when you ask me, is that philanthropy? No, it's an enormous amount of work. You know, between writing a check and spending 15 years building an institution that can work in the real world and create, you know, all kinds of jobs and support businesses owned by women and people of color and sustainability. You know, it's, trust me, it's a job for hundreds of people, and it's an organizational job, not writing a check and, you know, then calling back in a year and seeing how it's going. So that's, when you ask what am I proud of, I'm proud of the things that we've done that impact the real world in a measurable way, and where you can say, you know, it's not just I feel nice about this. This is what changed. These, you know, we can point to impacts, you know, specifically how many thousands of low-income housing loans have we made? You know, how many tons of CO2 have we prevented from going up in the atmosphere? You know, and you know, if you look at what I've done politically instead of starting Next Gen, you know, it's like, how many people have we contacted, registered, influenced to vote, created a broader democracy and a more representative democracy specifically for young people, for Black people, for brown people. You know, to me, what am I proud of? It's when we can show results over a long period of work that otherwise wouldn't have been done. That's what I'm proud of.
Thanks, Tom. I have so many questions to go through, and because you have such a fascinating life, but I know we're out of time. On you have a very tight schedule. One last question I wanted to ask you: we have young people who are watching this interview. Can you give them two pieces of advice? One on the financial side, because you've been very successful on that side, and one on the life in general, because you seem to be living the life you really love.
On the financial side, you know, I believe that running your life to maximize money brings you to the wrong place. I really do. And, you know, I feel as if people need to, like our bank, it needs to be sustainable. It has to be able to sustain itself, and people need to sustain themselves. But making decisions based on short-term money or even media is a gigantic, horrible mistake. And it takes you to places, and it leads you to careers that, you know, really aren't what you probably want to do. And so I would say, you know, people always say, follow your passion. Well, let me say this, follow your passion as long as it's sustainable, because you need to be, people also need to pay the bills. People need to have a place to live. People need to eat and, you know, clothe themselves and their families. So, I mean, I want to be reasonable. People need to be sensible, but beyond that, doing the things that you care the most about and trying to align your work life with your life, to me, really is the right way to think about money and the interaction of money, values, and family. And that pretty much, you know, and that, the other thing I'd say is this, which I always try to say to young people when they ask me this, is you should take yourself seriously. You know, the choices that you make at a young age have really long-lasting, impactful significance for you and for everybody around you. You are important. So the fact that you came to the United States at 21, a choice, changed your life. You know, whether you do, you know, the decisions that you make, that's a huge choice, but you make small choices along the way too, all the time. And doing, you know, taking yourself seriously, taking the impact on other people seriously, and doing the things that you're proud of really makes your life completely different and leads you to a different place and makes you different. So, you know, I think a lot of times if kids, and I use the word kids as anyone younger than me, make decisions flippantly, I think they're not valuing themselves enough. I think they're not taking themselves seriously enough and loving themselves and as much as they should be loved by themselves and everybody else. So that's what I say to young people is, look, take yourself really seriously, believe in yourself, work, try and get the things you think about, what you really care about, and try and do it, because you can probably do it.